Okay, just so to recap that, so discontinuous, if there's only certain variables it can have and it's a bar chart with big gaps between the bars. Continuous if it can take any value, and then you, if they're a large range of values, then you tend to split it up into smaller ranges and then have a bar for that particular range, so 130 to 134, 135 to 139, and then you can plot a line to help model it, and you'll see that you've got this bell-shaped curve, or this normal distribution, where you tend to have the largest frequency in the middle, and then it drops off either side, and you get this tail towards the edge. So that's how you would plot the data, and that allows you to see what kind of variation you've got to get a good idea of the actual variation across a group of organisms. Then you need to collect lots of data to make sure that you're not just sampling too small a set. So large amount of measurements is required when you're doing this kind of thing to see the expected patterns. So inheritance, basically inheritance is the passing on of characteristics from parents to offspring. And how that happens is via genetic material. So if you take this as a model of the cell, so you've got the cell, the outside of the cell here, and then in the center you've got the nucleus. Within the nucleus you have a set of chromosomes. Chromosomes are how the genetic material is stored within the nucleus. So this is your genetic material. And all different organisms have different numbers of chromosomes. So if you're human, then you've got 46, and dogs have 78. It's just two examples. The chromosomes themselves are made of the actual chemical which makes up the genetic material called DNA. So that is the genetic material chemical. And each chromosome is a very, very long chain of this DNA material. And you can see here it's paired up. C's pair up with G's, T's pair up with A's. And within this very, very long chain of DNA, there are sections which are called genes, and each gene is basically a section of DNA that produces characteristics. So you might have one gene which codes for your hair color, one that codes for your eye color. Now in reality, all of these traits or characteristics are very complex, and they don't tend to be based on just one gene, but for simplicity's sake now, one gene will code for a particular characteristic. So DNA is the chemical, sections of DNA are genes which produce particular characteristics, and then lots of genes are packed up within a chromosome, and then there's lots of different chromosomes depending on which organisms you are, and they are all held within inside the nucleus, which is held within inside the cell, which is the basic building block of us. How this is passed on, so your normal human cell contains 46 chromosomes, but the sex cells are only have half that many. So a sperm will have 23 chromosomes, and the egg will have 23, and when you add those two together, you get the first cell. In fertilization. Okay, so this first cell, this is the first time you are you, when the sperm from your father and the egg from your mother come together and fuse. Basically, they mix the chromosomes together in a process called fertilization, and that first cell then divides into 2 and then 4 and then 8, and eventually 9 months later you are born as you. The structure of this, we know it looks like this, was worked out in the 1950s. So there are 4 main cytosins involved. So Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin, they purified DNA, so they extracted it from cells. They've been able to extract it for much longer than that, but they were the first ones to produce very, very pure DNA, pass X-rays through it, and when they did that, after lots of hard work, they got this image here with all these dark spots. So from this structure, they could straight away tell that there was some helical structure to it. It had this helix structure, but it was Crick and Watson who managed to get the first correct model of the DNA with these 2 strands, and 1 strand runs downwards and 1 strand runs up, and you've got this pairing between the 2. So it's always an A linked with a T, and if it's a T on the other strand, then it's an A on the first strand, and then C and G and C. Crick, Watson and Wilkins won the Nobel Prize about 10 years later. Sadly, Franklin had died by this time, and the Nobel Committee doesn't award Nobel Prizes posthumously, so when the scientists had died. So these 3 were awarded the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the structure of DNA. A good story about why collaboration within science is really important, although the actual politics and scientific politics of what was going on at the time is a fascinating story, and one you'll learn about more in your GCSEs as time goes on. Right, so natural selection, so classically attributed to Darwin. He's the one who really brought it all together, but many other scientists involved in this over time. But evolution basically is the gradual change in characteristics of an organism as they adapt over time to an environment. So that's a good place to start. So gradual change in the characteristics of organisms over time as they adapt to their environment. Okay, so this would be an example of a finch in the Galapagos Islands, where they were blown out from South America, and this is the kind of ancestor, had this rather large beak, and then there were lots of different islands where there weren't really any predators, but lots of different foods, and so from one common ancestor over hundreds of years, their bills and their beaks, evolved over time to allow them to feed more effectively. So on one island there were buds and fruits, grubs, so if they were in the ground they had to dig into the ground, insects, small and sharp ones, and then leaves. So all different kind of beaks which allow them to feed effectively in there. So how does evolution work? Well, if we accept that there is variation in characteristics of organisms, just due to the imprecise way in which genetic material can be passed down. So although you are made from the chromosomes from your father and mother, it's not always perfectly copied, and it is mixed up as the sex cells are produced. But that's beyond what you need to know right now. So we just accept that there is variation within a population. And because you've got variation, you will have some that are better adapted to the environment than others. So some better adapted to the environment. So let's say this was the parent and it had 4 offspring, and they all had slightly different beaks, and they were on this island where they were eating buds and fruits. So the offspring which had this slightly different beak, which allowed it to eat the fruits better or quicker than the other offspring, this one would survive better, it would get more food, and therefore it would be healthier and stronger. These ones wouldn't get as much food and therefore would be weaker. So if you're better adapted to the environment, you're better able to survive or compete, and therefore reproduce. Okay, and this is normally called survival of the fittest. Okay, so if you're better able to compete and reproduce, survival of the fittest, therefore characteristics are passed on to the next generation. Okay, and so the characteristic which allowed it to survive and reproduce gets passed on to the next generation, and therefore is likely to be passed on to the next generation, and on, and therefore this adaptation becomes the norm within the generation. So the whole thing is evolution by the process of natural selection, and this is where the selection happens. If you are better able to compete because of your adaptation, you are being selected for, you are more likely to survive, therefore more likely to reproduce, and your characteristics are passed on. So over time you get evolution from more primitive creatures, and then as they adapt they become closer to what we see in everyday life. So our ancestors started walking just on their hind legs, allowed them to use their hands more, so therefore make tools and become more successful at competing for food and space and territory. So it takes millions of years. Fossil records show us that this has happened. We find good evidence within the fossil records that there were these creatures in the past that we don't see anymore, but have evolved in time to produce creatures that we see in the modern world, and it can happen over a relatively short time. So this is the peppered moth, it's a classic example, and there were two general variations, the pale coloured moth and the dark coloured moth. On normal trees, the pale coloured moth is well camouflaged and so not eaten by the birds, whereas the dark coloured moth is much more obvious, so the birds pick them off. So the dark coloured moth tend to get eaten quite quickly, so the light coloured moth is being selected for. It's survival of the fittest. The Industrial Revolution, however, chucked out a lot of smoke from all the coal burning stations that darkened the trees, and so forth. Therefore, suddenly the black coloured moth had a competitive advantage. The light coloured moth was more easily seen by the birds, and so therefore it got eaten. So this one was naturally selected for, and so the populations around the industrial town tended to be much dark coloured. You had much more of the dark coloured moth because they were better adapted to the particular environment. So the last bit is extinction. So extinction is simply when all of the organisms of a particular species are no longer alive.